Welcome and thank you to those who, gosh, that's loud. Welcome to those who've come to hear the talk, and particularly to those who've come back for second helpings. So if you've ever heard me before, then welcome back and you've survived. Today I'm going to be talking about Hull's Jewish community, one of Hull's oldest black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and one which we often ignore in terms of how the Jewish community is portrayed. Next slide, please. For most people, Hull Jewry today is depicted by one individual, Maureen Littman. I can see many smiley faces in the audience. Our Maureen, part of a very long established Jewish community here in Hull, was both the daughter of the president of a shul, or synagogue, and she was also a leading figure in Anglo Jewry for standing up against anti-Semitism. So like Hull, or shaped by Hull, this leading figure is a very important one through which we can approach Hull's Jewish past. But rather surprisingly, in terms of the City of Culture a few years ago, in which you can hopefully see Maureen depicted in this image, very few Jews were present in that story. Indeed, increasingly, as the community becomes aged and is increasingly statistically declining, the significance of Hull's Jewish community is often being neglected. So what I want to do to coincide with this Jewish Living exhibition is, I'm just checking if the slides are showing what I can see, is to very much go through some aspects briefly about Hull's Jewish history, which I hope you may not be as familiar with, as well as some that you may have heard before. It's a story that's 250 plus years old, and therefore Hull has one of the oldest post-admission Jewish communities in the UK. So what am I saying there? From 1066, with the Norman Conquest, Britain, or England and Wales, acquired a Jewish community. Later, they were expelled, and the Jewish community we know today was readmitted from 1656 onwards. So Hull's community is very much part of that readmission story rather than that ancient story. But hopefully there'll be something for all of you, and if not, come and heckle. Next slide. So the story I'm looking at today is about strangers, outsiders, people who had a different religion to the state religion here in England, of the Anglican Church, epitomised by this space, from 1760 onwards. From 1760 onwards, particularly 1766, we know Hull had the beginnings of a Jewish community. She had a synagogue from 1780, but informal gatherings of Jews can take place anywhere. It helps in a synagogue, but it can take place anywhere, and normally includes 10 males over the age of 13 years of age. So once the males have gone into adulthood and have gone through their bar mitzvah. What we found in terms of the arrival of this community is that here they saw the emergence of a port that was far smaller than the community, the spaces that we surround us today. But Hull Jews found in Hull, just a stone's throw away from here, in 10 Thaves Alley, established a community and a safe place. What's surprising with this is that a non-Christian community was welcomed. And that's because at the same time, Catholics were still being demonized here in Hull. We have King Billy's statue around the corner, showing us the restoration of the Protestant church over the Catholic church. So in a city where Catholicism was often reviled, Jews were welcomed and Jews were tolerated. And this is a scene which very much many of them would have seen as they arrived in the port, because this is opposite what's now the Deep. I'll talk about that spot later, so if you think about that, keep that at the back of your mind. But Hull was a multi-ethnic, multi-racial entrepot in which Jews were part of the story. But from the Napoleonic Wars onwards, Jews increasingly found in Hull a safe place to live. Most arrived near the entrance of the harbour, the entrance of the River Hull, and from here they were taken the short distance away to the customs house, which was in Boots by the Napoleonic Wars, down Whitefrigate. the Neptune Inn. Here, they would have surrendered their papers, as all aliens would do, and in return, the state documented here in Hull the arrival of aliens shown in here. And this certificate, of which Hull's History Centre has one of the best examples of documents, we can see the arrival of a female Jewish figure, Rachel Myers, and her sister, who we assume was on the way to Sheffield. So what we see is Hull was very much, in this early period, a place not for settlement, but for transit. Not to America and Canada, that I'll talk about later, but instead to the hinterland of Hull. And it would use the inland waterways to navigate. We seldom think of Jews travelling in this way, but we find stories of Jews who would have arrived through Hull, getting as far as Leeds and Sheffield, and indeed in the burial tradition of Hull Jewry, they assumed responsibility for burying people as far as they could travel. So there were people buried in Hull's Jewish cemetery who come from as far south as King's Lynn, as far north as Scarborough, and as far west, I think, as York. So this is how far the community represented this regional hinterland. Lazarus Levy, who, according to records, I don't ever believe them, but that's what they tell us, died at the age of 105 in 1799, arrived through here and is a Levi. That's part of a priestly tradition of names which the Jewish community, which acknowledged to the other Jews that they would have had a biblical role historically in terms of their identity. So Hull was a gateway, a harbour in which Jews would come from the Netherlands, from Belgium, and from Germany. A very small, short sea routes to here, and then they would travel further inland. But with the relocation of a prize court during the Napoleonic Wars, part of the attack on the French, more Jews began to relocate into Hull from Hampshire, the sunny delights, up to the tropical north. They clearly come for the sunshine, and we found Hull's Jewish community grew exponentially in people who were highly skilled in hawking, in reselling, and in supplying or victualling the Royal Navy during the period of the Napoleonic Wars. Largely males would arrive, followed by their loved ones and eventually children. But the community remained small, less than 100, until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Most were Ashkenazi Jews. That's Jews coming from Germany and Eastern Europe. But there were some Sephardi Jews too, who were from older Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal. And according to court records from the East Riding Archives at Beverley, we find that there was a Joseph Yeltsin, late of Gibraltar, who was there too. Gibraltar Jews were very common during the Napoleonic Wars. I can't ask here, but I would normally ask people, can anyone name the most famous dynasty that was of Gibraltar and Jewry? And that's Benjamin Disraeli. So his family were of that tradition too. So Hull Jewry at the time was very diverse and very dynamic. The rise, though, of the Sephardic Jews, so these are Jews of Iberian origin, were made more easy or made more possible by the rise to the highest office in the UK, the Prime Minister, by Benjamin Disraeli. If you think of his name, it was originally spelt Benjamin D'(Israeli), so it literally saying the Jew, and his anglicised name was Disraeli. His grandfather, an investor from Gibraltar, enabled from that financial wealth, he absorbed Christianity, was baptized into the Church of England, and this enabled Disraeli to become Prime Minister, because religious disabilities on the highest office of the UK remain until 1858. In other words, if you are not a practicing Anglican who can swear on the King James Bible, you are not to be admitted until the English Parliament. So we can see this context. Politically, Britain wasn't an absorbing place for outsiders, and even until Prince William's second child, You have to be primogenitor, continues, and even now, Prince William's children, if they were Catholic, are debarred from the crown. So we can see how these religious disabilities matter. For $1 million question, has anyone ever seen this carving before of Disraeli? Does anyone want to know which tropical delight it's located in? Withensea, Bridlington, Aberdeen? Fantastic. Beverley. So I don't know what carvings there are in this building by Elwell. I should know because he's a distant relative. But here we have a cartoon in Beverley called The Political Cheapjack, an attack on Disraeli in, of all places, Beverley. So we see here that Disraeli and Jewish figures are increasingly visual, and they are depicted into the point where people in the street can understand these. These elite figures were not unique. Key elite figures, including German Jews, Kaiserjuden, who advised the Kaiser of Germany, Baghdadi Jews, who were part of the court of the future Edward VII, then Prince of Wales, were accommodated across Britain, but also here in Hull. So what have these Kaiserjuden got to do with it? The one on your left, Albert Ballin, used to ship migrants to Hull until he decided he could ship them direct to America on his Hamburg America line. Once he did, it undermined Hull's position as one of the top 3 migrant ports on Earth. So they're very important too. But he regularly met people here in Hull. He didn't insist on them respecting his Jewish identity, but he did say, if you don't speak to me in German, I will not come to the negotiating table. The English had to learn, dare we say it, a foreign language, and he would respond then in perfect English. So we can see here that the dynamics of identity are not just confessional, they're not just religious. The man in the middle, you may never have seen before. He was part of an important dynasty called the Sassoons, who were from Baghdad in Iraq, a different Jewish tradition. So we can see how a mosaic emerges of Sephardi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Baghdadi Jews, later Reform Jews and cultural Jews. So we have lots of different types of Jews who settle. What was his involvement with Hull? Well, we know he visited, because in the bottom left, he came with the Prince of Wales to a scandal called the Baccarat scandal, which for many of you, I can see some nodding heads, was when an illegal game of gambling took place at Tranby Croft in Anlaby, and this led to the Prince of Wales appearing in court, which at the time created a shudder. I know if any of you are following the Harry and Meghan case, they're having a shudder at the minute about a senior royal being in the court of England. So anyway, this was an important point there, is that elite Jews of differing ethnic variants were being admitted into different important households across the UK and here in Hull. Meanwhile, here in Hull, another type of Jew came to settle, German Jews. And you may think, well, what's unusual about that? German Jews by the 19th century had a tradition of marrying out. So not just marrying fellow Jews. So actually what we have here is a man called Samuelson. Has anyone ever heard of Sammy's Point? Samuelson was Jewish. And so we see here Martin Samuelson's shipyard, the site of the Deep that I mentioned earlier. And he was an important shipbuilder, but also married out. So what we find is shipbuilding in Hull, iron production in South Shields, across the east coast of England, Jews found new opportunities in the places connecting ports and commerce. And so what we find here is one of the most iconic places in the city was expanded and developed by Samuelson, who was a maritime engineer, one of the first Jewish maritime engineers in the UK, before becoming a civil engineer, and he expanded the land upon which the Deep is now built. The Cup underneath, which you can see, was one of the famous vessels he built. Hull launched the largest number of steamships in British history on one day in 1864. Why? Because the owner knew if he launched 4 ships in one day, he would beat all records, and therefore the Times of London followed his story. By the mid-19th century, the point of arrival for these Jewish outsiders had shifted from the river entrance to the safety of the marina. And for anyone who knows the Holiday Inn, conveniently located next to the disembarkation point, it's that location in which Wilson liners, you can see them on the left-hand side here, would have disembarked people. And for anyone particularly observant, you can see this church in the background. So we get an entire story. Jews were increasingly brought into the safe anchorage of the harbour at Hull and no longer had to surrender their papers. You only produce a passport during wartime. England doesn't demand a passport until 1919, and therefore Jews begin to come to settle or to travel through on their way to America. Hull today, I'm going to be talking about, was part of a place where immigrants came. And in a league table of immigration into the UK, we hear about these every single minute of the day in the British media at the minute, but a century ago, on the league table, London was the biggest point of arrival, followed by Grimsby and then Hull. Meanwhile, those coming through on the way to America, Hull was the top number one. Those coming through to America through Grimsby came second and London third. And so what we find is there's a large number of people coming through. Now, for anyone who's got increasingly good vision and can see the text that far, well done. Please tell me which opticians you go to. What you can notice here is there is not a single label that mentions Jewish migrants. Does that make sense? Britain may have been prejudiced. She was never anti-Semitic. America, by this point, was gathering data on Hebrews. Britain didn't. And so what we find is that in these number of immigrants, we get the nationality of the Jews being depicted by their country of birth, mainly Russia, but also Austria-Hungary, and to a lesser extent, other countries, including Holland, and Germany. This was the nadir of Ashkenazi Jews, Jews who you are probably most familiar with, Maureen Littman's ancestors, and they follow a different tradition to the Sephardim. It's the Ashkenazi Jews of German origin who largely erect at the maximum 4 synagogues in Hull by 1922. And here what we have is they are fleeing Tsarist persecution. Any of the places you hear every day on the news with Ukraine are the places these Jews would have come from. So Nikolaev, Kiev, Warsaw, lots of these different places from Poland and modern-day Ukraine, Lithuania and Latvia. They disembark in either Princess Dock or Humber Dock. And you can see here before what's now the area where Princess Quay was developed, we have this slow expansion of settlement around the western part of the docks. The migrants settle within a stone's throw of their point of disembarkation. For anyone who knows Hull, just near the marina, you would have a point of settlement, and slowly over generations, the Jews who arrive move about a mile a generation. What they do is to bring different skills and establish themselves into the economic systems of Hull. They never claim parochial help. If they did, they would have appeared in the parish records for churches like the Minster, sorry. Instead, they become self-sustaining, economically independent, and they quickly establish themselves in lots of different professions. On your top left here, we have Hepworth's Arcade, a Jewish tailor, Hepworth. Within that, the location of the first Marks and Spencer in Hull. And then we have Jeff Levy's clothing house. We have Moshe Rasinski, or as you know him, Montague Burton, who owned the Debenhams Topshop Arcadia Group. And of course, bottom left, Maureen Littman's dad's shop, just near the quayside. So tailoring is one of the key professions they would enter locally. But of course, quickly, along with this westward migration, many of the Jewish community, these Ashkenazi Jews, entered the professions. Rather like other migrant groups, especially the Indian community, they believed in education, 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 so they could achieve and rise up. So you have the law industry, which was either run or owned by the Jewish community, including companies like Graham and Rosen, whose representatives are here in the form of my brother today, Goschalks, Max Gold, Meyer Wolf. Nearly all community lawyers in Hull knew to standing up for rights was important, and you could make a living from that. Max, of course, top right, for anyone who didn't know him, was a leader of the synagogue, but also an incredibly important figure across the city, and a rugby player, and just a general good egg. And he regularly represented everybody marginalised, and I think achieved the rank of being the only practicing lawyer to read the Torah in court, often according to one witness, during the actual proceedings. But that's regardless. His religiosity shone through, and if anyone knows Max, you will have a million Max stories which are well worth their repeating, just not being videoed. Also, we have other figures, opticians like the Bushes, and as well as that, Ian Sugarman, one member of the Reformed Jewish community in Hull, who show that the business of helping others in the professions continues to this day. This rise of these outsiders to become essential insiders and pillars of the community also meant that they could influence large parts of Hull's civic life too. The Jewish community disproportionately had a greater influence in politics locally, and we've even had a thrice Lord Mayor in the form of Harry Feldman in the bottom right. Hull's first crematoria, the first public crematoria in the UK, was opened by another Jewish mayor. And if you ever sit in the Lord Mayor's Council chamber, shown in the top right, above the Lord Mayor, you can see a Jewish clock by the Jacobs Jewry firm. So there's lots of different figures who represent and contribute to civic life too. There's also support for another thing, Palestine. And Hull Jews are very much supporters of Israel as part of their belief to it being a homeland. What Hull didn't have, though, like Manchester, like Leeds, or like London, was an ethnic ghetto. The community was distributed. There was no one street with more than 20% of people born being migrants in Hull's history. And therefore, really, what we find is this continual movement, this assimilation into the suburbs of individuals, meant that Hull Jews were never perceived as an immigrant burden, to quote common language. Yet they did sustain and maintain their religious beliefs by having the other things to do with Jewish life, which you can see around the corner. Kosher butchers, kosher bakeries, kosher delicatessen, kosher fish and chip shops. I won't ask who remembers the kosher fish and chip shops, but if you do, at the time they were fish and chips were fried in a very unusual thing, oil. For anyone who's that young, you won't know those days, but at the time that was seen as very revolutionary and meant they were kosher. And so therefore, we have lots of different things that enabled them to flourish. But, as many people know through my work, the biggest destination of many of those Jews who were coming through was America, Canada, South Africa. Hull was one of the top 3 gateways on earth for mass migrants, particularly of Jews. And so what we find is Hull's railway connections enabled more Jews to reach different places. The Tiger's Lair, as it now is, as an emigrant waiting room, the separate emigrant platform, and an ability to reach Liverpool in a great speed. You can tell TransPennine Railways were not in charge at that time. I'm only joking if anyone loves them, but if you do, well, anyway, never mind. The point is, Liverpool was accessible within 3 hours 57 and 4 hours 3 minutes on a rail journey. And therefore, this enabled Hull to facilitate mass emigration through Glasgow, Liverpool, Southampton and London. And thus, Jews on Titanic came through Hull too. Around Hull, we have lots of different businesses, but the nearest one, if you exclude the market outside where Jews used to be merchants, was at nearby Postongate, where Harry Lazarus's hotel is. For anyone who's never been inside, I've only been in 4 times, but it's took quite a long time to get in. It's a completely frozen in time since 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War, and shows us how people were fed en route to their departure of their train. So once the steamship had arrived, you would wait a few hours, and then you would go on to Liverpool on a train. But in the break, you were given feeding kosher food if you needed it at the nearby lodging house. And Harry Lazarus shown here, Harry Lazarus, shown here, met people having relocated from the Jewish East End in 1863 and helped them transit Hull on the way to Liverpool. And so we can see how successful traders who were Jewish eked out an existence. He also married out. His first wife was Jewish, and he had one family. His second wife, when she died, his second wife he remarried, he had a Norwegian wife, and therefore you can see how they could accommodate for Nordic migrants as well as Jewish ones. But ultimately, one of the reasons we're here is about faith in the city. Hull's synagogues and Hull's religious infrastructure has often emerged, but often been evaporated either through bombing or regeneration. The synagogue that's most well known, the Linear Street one from 1903 onward to 1993, was both designed by the son of the president of the synagogue, and you may be able to see architecture by him in that similar use of colour brick across Hull and East Yorkshire, and really became the epicenter. But by the time it opened, another synagogue in Ann Street, the one that became Heaven and Hell later, was for the immigrant synagogue. So there was quickly an established synagogue in Linear Street, the genteel surroundings, and there was an immigrant one where pauper immigrants would have worshipped too. There were later synagogues, but I haven't got time to go into those too. Next door to that synagogue was a Hull Hebrew school, where people could go as part of a normal primary school, but also during Shabbat, the Sabbath, you could receive additional learning about Jewish life, Jewish religion, and Jewish faith. And we see here the girls' school in the 1930s. Separately, a discovery made by the Hull History Centre was that there was also a mikveh, which is a ritual bath in Hull, or in Jewish life. And this was provided uniquely in Hull by the local authority. So what we have are religious submersions take place periodically, different times if you're male or female, and the mikveh in Hull was provided by Hull City Council. So Hull as a council, Hull as a city, Hull as a port, accommodated and supported this ethnic minority. And in bottom right, you can see one of Hull's oldest Jewish cemeteries on Hessel Road next to the Alexandra pub. And if you look through there, the gate you can find. But Max Gold, that character I mentioned, introduced aspects of religious diversity many of you may have missed. If any of you see in the middle, his old legal chambers, did anyone ever remember Max Gold's legal chambers there in Suffolk House? Okay, if you ever went through the entrance, just to the right of it was a little tiny box, and in there was his mezuzah. So this is what's on the home of every Jewish home. So I asked, why is it on your business, Max? He said, I lived there. So his wife didn't disagree. So the point here was often religious identity is hidden away in doorways and in hidden ways, but Max was very proud of his religiosity and always wore a kippah and always had a Torah on his possession. Across Hull, though, there's a plethora of different ways in which Jewishness, Anglo-Jewish heritage, is on display. We have this fantastic piece of sculpture by Epstein, which is in the Ferrens Art Gallery. We have Maureen Littman with a statue of Amy Johnson, which she unveiled. We've got also another earlier statue to Amy Johnson, unveiled by a member of the Rosen family when he was Lord Mayor. And also we have the architecture. So across Hull and East Yorkshire, you will see architecture by Jewish people, and you will see, particularly if you were looking at this particular example, there are examples in Hull, Hessel Road, in the Costa Coffee, across the length and breadth of the area, and show just how innovative and dynamic the cultural contributions of Jews have been, whether trading or celebrating, nurturing, educating, helping the helpless, or also shaping the landscape. But did you see this, Jews, in my other piece of work, the one I did earlier, a projection on the deep in 2017? Ahead of that, they asked for lots of different images for it. So if you looked carefully, you may have seen the name Maureen Lipman. Did anyone see that? Did you also see this? Schenkers. So for some of you of a particular age generation, you may remember Schenkers. So this was also hidden away in the graphic, so you'd have done very well to notice where it was. But here it shows that bus tickets even promoted Jewish businesses, as long as Jewish lawyers and other things in their time too. So what am I saying in this discussion? Since 1766, Hull has been enhanced and significantly improved by the presence, the long permanent presence of a Jewish community. The Jewish community, in reward for toleration and respect for their community and their religious practices, were rewarded by continual support and loyalty by the Jewish community. Many who I've spoken to have argued there was a greater discussion in the synagogue about Hull City's performance than there was about clerical affairs, but that's for the community to decide. Hull, though, was a major transit port of global proportions, and therefore, around the world, wherever you go, there are people who migrated through this great city. Though transmigration was important, the individuals only stayed for a short period of time. The immigrants who stayed worked hard, worked to assimilate, to integrate, and to celebrate Hull as well as their identity. Everywhere in the world there's a link to Hull, but everywhere in Hull there's a link to Judaism. Please look carefully, but if you want further clues, please come and ask, and I'll try and help guide you to find out those hidden stories which are not yet visible. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Nick. That was very informative and interesting.